Gwen's dignity died at 1:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and honestly, it went out ugly. 3 minutes of voice message. Tears that could qualify as sobbing. Profanity that would have impressed her ex if he'd cared enough to listen. The phrase, "I don't know how to do this alone," repeated until it stopped sounding like words and started sounding like surrender. She'd hit send before her brain could stop her hands. 5 seconds later, she realized her mistake. The recipient wasn't her deadbeat ex-boyfriend. It was someone infinitely worse. Or better. She hadn't decided which yet, all while her baby screamed in the background like a tiny, furious alarm system. She'd been trying to leave a message for her ex, Marcus. Her phone was propped on the kitchen counter while she paced with Roland, and she'd just started talking, venting, breaking down in the way she only let herself do at 1 a.m. when no one was watching. "I know you don't care," she'd said into the phone, her voice cracking. "But he's crying and I'm out of formula and my shift got cut and Marcus, I can't do this alone. I know you don't want to be his father, but could you at least? Could you just send something? Anything? I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for him." Roland had wailed louder, and Gwen had felt tears sliding down her face. $30, she'd whispered. "That's all I need. Just $30, and I can feed him for the rest of the week and figure out the rest. Please." She'd ended the message and hit send. Then she'd looked at the screen. Really looked. The name at the top of the thread wasn't Marcus Thompson, deadbeat. It was Giorgio Castelli. Do not contact unless emergency. She'd saved his contact that way 6 months ago, when she'd briefly done bookkeeping for a restaurant that had some kind of business relationship with him. The owner had given her the number with specific instructions. Only use this if the place is literally on fire. And she'd just sent him a 3-minute voice message of her crying, begging for $30, with her baby screaming in the background. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." She tried to delete the message, but voice messages couldn't be unsent. They just existed. Out there, in the universe, in Giorgio Castelli's phone. Okay, she thought, trying to control her breathing. Maybe he won't listen to it. Maybe he'll just delete it. Maybe. Her phone rang. The screen showed, "Giorgio Castelli. Do not contact unless emergency." Gwen's entire body went cold. He was calling her. At 1:51 a.m., after receiving her disaster voice message, for a long moment, she just stared at the ringing phone, paralyzed with equal parts terror and confusion. Then, because Roland was still crying and her brain had officially given up on self-preservation, she answered. "Hello? Is he still crying?" The voice was male, accented, and far calmer than it had any right to be. Gwen blinked. "I what?" "The baby," Giorgio's voice clarified. "In your message, is he still crying?" She looked down at Roland, who had worked himself into that particular shade of red that babies achieved when they were both furious and exhausted. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to send that to you. I was trying to... I know who you were trying to reach." Something in his tone made her stop talking. "How old is the baby?" 3 weeks. "And you're out of formula." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes." Silence on the line. Not empty silence, she could hear him breathing, could almost feel him thinking. "What's your address?" Gwen's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Why?" "Because," Giorgio said simply, "I'm bringing you formula. You don't have to..." "I know I don't have to." His voice was matter-of-fact. "What's your address?" And Gwen, sleep-deprived and desperate and completely out of other options, gave it to him. "Stay inside," he said. "Lock your door. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up before she could respond. Gwen stood in her dim kitchen, holding her screaming baby, trying to process what had just happened. A mafia boss, an actual, real-life, dangerous person, was bringing her baby formula because she'd accidentally sent him a crying voice message meant for her deadbeat ex. "Roland," she whispered to her son, "your mother's life has officially become a plot that no one would believe." 23 minutes later, there was a knock at her door. She looked through the peephole and saw a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a film about elegant danger. Dark coat, perfect posture, holding 2 large shopping bags and looking directly at the peephole like he knew exactly where she was standing. "This is insane," Gwen thought. "This is absolutely insane." She opened the door anyway. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys good stories. Also, comment where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It really helps YouTube show you more stories like this one. Now, let's get back to it. The shipment inventory was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just wrong enough that it meant someone in the supply chain was either incompetent or stealing. Giorgio needed to determine which before deciding how to handle it. He was reviewing spreadsheets in his study when his phone rang. Unknown number, but it came through on his private line, the one connected to business contacts. He almost didn't answer. But something made him check the notification. Voice message, 3 minutes and 14 seconds. From a contact labeled Thompson Restaurant Books. He didn't recognize the name immediately. Probably some bookkeeper from one of the businesses he had interests in. They rarely contacted him directly unless something was seriously wrong. He tapped play. The message started with crying. Not subtle crying, the kind of crying that came from someone who'd hit their breaking point. A woman's voice, shaky and exhausted. "I know you don't care, but he's crying and I'm out of formula." There was a baby screaming in the background. Not fussy crying, desperate crying. Giorgio sat forward in his chair. The woman kept talking, begging, apologizing, breaking. $30 for formula, working alone. The father gone. The baby's cries got louder. The woman's voice got softer. And something in Giorgio's chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. He pulled up the contact. Thompson, Restaurant Books, 6 months ago. The message ended, "Please." Just that. Nothing else. Giorgio stared at his phone for exactly 5 seconds. Then he called her back. When she answered, her voice was small. "Hello? Is he still crying?" he asked. Because that seemed more important than any other question. The conversation was brief. She was terrified he could hear it, but also desperate enough to give him her address despite that fear. He hung up and immediately called Marco. "Boss? I need you to pick up formula, diapers, and whatever else newborns need," Giorgio said, already grabbing his coat. "Meet me at—" He checked the address. "The address I'm sending you. 20 minutes. Everything okay?" "Yes," Giorgio said, though he wasn't entirely sure why he was doing this. Why a misdirected voice message from a stranger had cut through years of carefully maintained emotional distance. But as he walked to his car, all he could hear was that baby's desperate crying and that woman's broken voice asking for $30. In his world, $30 was nothing. In hers, apparently, it was everything. Gwen opened the door slowly, keeping the chain lock engaged until the very last second. Not that a chain lock would do much against someone like Giorgio Castelli, but it made her feel slightly less insane about what she was doing. He stood in her hallway like he'd been designed specifically to make cheap apartment lighting look better. The fluorescent bulb that usually made everyone look vaguely ill somehow emphasized the sharp line of his jaw, the dark intensity of his eyes. He was tall, she'd forgotten how tall, and wearing a black wool coat that probably cost more than her car. If she still had a car. "Miss Thompson," he said, his accent wrapping around her name like it was something worth pronouncing correctly. "Gwen," she corrected automatically. then immediately wondered why she was offering her first name to a man whose reputation made grown men nervous. Just Gwen. He nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and permission. Then he lifted the shopping bags he was holding, 2 of them, large, the expensive, reusable kind from upscale grocery stores. "May I?" He gestured toward her apartment, but didn't move, waiting for permission. That surprised her. In her experience, powerful men didn't ask permission. They took. They assumed. They walked through doors like they owned every room they entered. But Giorgio Castelli stood in her dingy hallway, holding shopping bags full of baby supplies, and waited. "Oh," Gwen said, stepping back and pulling the door fully open. "Yes. Sorry. Come in." He entered her apartment with the kind of careful awareness that made her suddenly conscious of everything wrong with her living situation. The stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the laundry she hadn't had time to fold, draped over the single chair, the water stain on the ceiling from when the upstairs neighbor's toilet had leaked 3 months ago. But if Giorgio noticed any of it, his expression didn't show it. He simply set the bags on her kitchen counter, the only clear surface available, and stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. Roland, still pressed against Gwen's shoulder, had temporarily stopped crying. Now he was making those little hiccuping sounds that babies made after crying too long, his tiny body shuddering with leftover distress. "He's calmer now," Giorgio observed. "For the moment," Gwen said, swaying slightly in the universal dance of exhausted mothers everywhere. "He's probably just too tired to keep protesting. But the second he remembers he's hungry, we'll start round 17 of the crying concert." 17, Giorgio repeated, and something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "You've been counting." When you're this tired, you count everything. Cries, hours since sleep, days until you can afford groceries." She stopped, realizing she was rambling. "Sorry, I'm not usually this much of a disaster." "You're not a disaster," he said simply. "You're a mother dealing with an impossible situation." The gentleness in his voice caught her off guard. She'd expected judgment, maybe pity, possibly irritation at being dragged across the city at 3 a.m, but not understanding. "I should explain," Gwen started, shifting Roland to her other shoulder. "That screenshot. I didn't mean to." "I know," he interrupted quietly. "It was meant for someone else. My ex," she clarified, because apparently her exhausted brain had decided full transparency was the best policy. Roland's father, who is, as of 3 weeks ago, not interested in being a father or a human being with basic decency. Either one, really. Giorgio's expression didn't change, but something in the air around him did. A subtle shift, like a temperature drop. "He left you." It wasn't a question. "He left before Roland was born," Gwen said, aiming for casual and landing somewhere near bitter. "Found out I was pregnant and suddenly remembered he had dreams, ambitions, a complete inability to handle responsibility." "His name," Giorgio said, his voice still calm but with an edge underneath that made Gwen's survival instincts finally wake up. "Why?" she asked carefully. "Because men who abandon their children should be reminded of their obligations." There was something almost conversational about the way he said it, like he was discussing the weather, not implying whatever it was he was implying. Gwen readjusted Roland again, using the movement to buy herself thinking time. "That's really not necessary. I don't want money from him. I just want." She stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. What did she want? For Marcus to suddenly become a different person? For the past 9 months to rewind so she could make different choices? "You want your son to be safe and fed," Giorgio finished for her. "That's not unreasonable." He pulled items from the bags as he spoke. Formula containers, 3 of them, different brands, a package of bottles, still in plastic, diapers in the size Roland currently needed, baby wipes, something that looked like diaper rash cream. Gwen stared at the counter as it filled with supplies. "This is too much." "It's what was available at the 24-hour store," he said, still unpacking. "I wasn't sure which formula brand, so Marco grabbed several. If there's a specific kind that works better." "Who's Marco?" "Someone who works with me." He pulled out the last item, a soft blanket with elephants on it, and set it down with surprising gentleness. He has 3 children. He knew what to bring. The blanket was what broke something loose in Gwen's chest. Not the formula, not the diapers, not even the late-night drive across the city. The blanket. The thoughtfulness of it. The acknowledgement that babies needed more than just food, they needed comfort. She felt tears building and absolutely refused to let them fall. Not now. Not in front of this stranger who'd already seen her at her lowest. "I can't pay you back," she said, her voice rougher than intended. "Not Friday. Not anytime soon. I know I said Friday in the text, but I was lying. Or maybe just optimistic. I don't know anymore." "I don't want payment," Giorgio said. "Everyone wants payment," Gwen countered, defaulting to sarcasm because it was safer than vulnerability. "That's how capitalism works. I send embarrassing screenshots, you bring supplies, I owe you money, and probably my firstborn son. Which, ironically, is the son we're trying to feed. So that would be counterproductive." His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make her wonder what an actual smile would look like on that serious face. "You owe me nothing," he said. "That's not how—" "Gwen." The way he said her name stopped her mid-sentence. Not commanding, not demanding, just definite. "I came because a child was hungry. That's all. There's no debt, no obligation." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist on terms, on boundaries, on some framework that made this make sense. But Roland chose that moment to make another sound, half cry, half whimper, and her attention immediately shifted. "Okay, buddy," she murmured, adjusting him again. "I know. Just let me." "Give him to me," Giorgio said. Gwen's head snapped up. "What?" "Let me hold him while you prepare a bottle." He moved closer, not crowding her, just closing the distance enough to be helpful. "You've been holding him for hours. Your arms must be exhausted." They were. Her shoulders ached, her back was screaming, and she was pretty sure her left arm had fallen asleep somewhere around midnight. But handing her 3-week-old baby to a man she didn't know, a dangerous man, regardless of how helpful he was, being felt wrong on multiple levels. Giorgio seemed to read her hesitation. "I won't leave this kitchen," he said quietly. "You can watch me the entire time, and if you're uncomfortable at any moment, you take him back." It was the last part that decided her. The acknowledgement that she had control, that this was her choice. "Okay," she said slowly. "But he's been crying a lot, so he's probably going to immediately start screaming at you." "I'll survive," Giorgio said, and held out his hands. Gwen transferred Roland carefully, watching the way Giorgio's hands, large, scarred in places, definitely hands that had seen violence, cradled her tiny son with unexpected gentleness. He held Roland against his chest, one hand supporting his head, the other supporting his body, his movements confident in a way that suggested this wasn't his first time holding a baby. Roland made a soft sound and turned his face toward Giorgio's chest, probably searching for food that wasn't there. "He's going to be disappointed," Gwen warned, already reaching for the formula. "He'll survive a few more minutes," Giorgio said, his voice dropping to something softer as he looked down at Roland. "Won't you?" Gwen tried to focus on preparing the bottle, reading the instructions on the formula can, measuring the powder, adding water, but she kept glancing back at the surreal sight of Giorgio Castelli standing in her kitchen, holding her baby like it was the most natural thing in the world. Roland's tiny hand had found its way to Giorgio's coat, gripping the fabric with that instinctive baby grasp that turned everything into a lifeline. And something in Giorgio's expression shifted, softened. The dangerous edge that lived in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something almost tender. "What's his full name?" Giorgio asked quietly. "Roland Michael Thompson," Gwen said, shaking the bottle to mix the formula. "I named him after my grandfather. He was the only person in my family who really gave a damn, and he died when I was 15. "Roland Michael," Giorgio repeated, testing the name. "It's a good name. Strong. Let's hope he lives up to it," Gwen said, checking the bottle's temperature on her wrist. "Because right now he's mostly just good at crying and ruining my sleep schedule." She crossed back to Giorgio and reached for Roland. "Okay, I'll take him now." But Giorgio didn't immediately hand him over. Instead, he looked at her directly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "A child should never go hungry," he said quietly. "You owe me nothing. Sleep when you can." Then he transferred Roland back into her arms with the same care he'd used to take him. Gwen stood there, holding her son and the bottle, trying to process the entire last hour of her life. "Thank you," she managed. "Really, I don't know what I would have." "Feed him," Giorgio interrupted gently. "He's waited long enough." He moved toward the door, and Gwen followed, still cradling Roland. At the threshold, Giorgio paused and turned back. "If you need anything else, I won't text you again," Gwen said quickly. "This was an accident. I'm not going to make it a habit to bother you." Something flickered across his face. Not offense, more like consideration. "It wasn't a bother," he said finally. Then he nodded once and stepped into the hallway. Gwen closed the door and engaged all 3 locks, her hands moving on autopilot. She looked down at Roland, who was already rooting toward the bottle. "Your mother," she whispered, "just had the strangest night of her life." She sat on the couch, positioned the bottle, and watched Roland finally start eating. His little hands came up to grip it. His eyes closed in relief. And Gwen sat in her quiet apartment, feeding her son with formula purchased by a Mafia boss who'd shown up at 3 in the morning without judgment, without conditions, without anything except unexpected kindness. She was confused. She was exhausted. And she was, though she wouldn't admit it yet, just a little bit intrigued. Stephanie took one look at the formula containers lined up on Gwen's counter and froze mid-step. "Where did those come from?" she asked, setting down the coffee she'd brought. Her eyes moved from the expensive brands to the unopened package of bottles to the soft elephant blanket draped over the back of Gwen's only chair. Gwen kept her focus on Roland, currently sprawled across her lap in that boneless way sleeping babies achieved. "Someone helped me out." "Someone," Stephanie repeated slowly. She picked up one of the formula containers, examining it like it might explode. "Gwen, this is the premium stuff. This is $40 a container. Who exactly is this someone?" "Just a guy." "A guy." Stephanie's voice climbed half an octave. "You're being deliberately vague, which means it's either really good or really bad. Given your track record with men, I'm guessing bad." "It's not like that," Gwen said, though she wasn't entirely sure what like that even meant in this context. "I accidentally texted him asking for help, and he brought supplies. That's it. You accidentally texted a man who can afford to drop $150 on baby formula at 3 in the morning?" Stephanie sat down on the arm of the couch, her expression shifting from curious to concerned. "Gwen, what's his name?" Gwen hesitated just long enough for Stephanie to notice. "Oh God," Stephanie breathed. "It's someone I know, isn't it? Tell me it's not Marcus. Tell me you didn't let that worthless—" "It's not Marcus," Gwen cut her off. "It's Giorgio Castelli." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Physical, suffocating. Stephanie stood up slowly. "Please tell me you're joking." "I'm not. Giorgio Castelli. The Giorgio Castelli." Stephanie's voice had dropped to a whisper. "The one whose name people only say when they're absolutely sure he's not in the room? I didn't know who else too. It was an accident, Steph. I meant to text Marcus, but the contacts got mixed up, and before I knew it, he was at my door with supplies." Gwen adjusted Roland carefully. "He was actually really kind about it." "Kind," Stephanie repeated flatly. "Gwen, Giorgio Castelli isn't a man who gives anything for free. People like him, they don't do favors. They make investments. And right now, you're the investment." "That's not 5. You need to be careful," Stephanie continued, her tone shifting from shocked to protective. "I'm serious. Men like him don't show up at random apartments in the middle of the night because they're feeling charitable. There's always an angle. Always." Gwen wanted to argue, wanted to point out that Giorgio had explicitly said she owed him nothing, that he'd held Roland with gentleness, that he'd asked permission before entering her apartment. But Stephanie's words lodged themselves somewhere in her chest anyway, sharp and uncomfortable. "I know what I'm doing," Gwen said quietly. "Do you?" Stephanie's voice was softer now, almost sad. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're so desperate for help that you're willing to ignore every red flag in the book." Roland stirred against Gwen's chest, making a small sound in his sleep. She rubbed his back automatically, the gesture so practiced now it didn't require thought. "He's not going to ask for anything," Gwen said, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Stephanie or herself. "It was just a moment of kindness. That's all." Stephanie looked like she wanted to say more, but eventually just shook her head. "I hope you're right. I really do." After Stephanie left, Gwen tried to focus on normal things. Laundry, dishes, the email from her supervisor about picking up an extra shift next week. But Stephanie's warning kept circling back, persistent and uncomfortable. Giorgio Castelli isn't a man who gives anything for free. Her phone buzzed on the counter. "Giorgio C. Did Roland eat today?" Gwen stared at the message for a long moment. It was simple, direct, the kind of question that didn't have layers or ulterior motives. She typed back, "Yes. Thank you again for the formula." The response came quickly. "Giorgio C. Good." That was it. Just one word. No demands. No requests for repayment. No angles. Gwen set her phone down and tried to convince herself that Stephanie was wrong. The message came 2 days later, in the middle of Roland's afternoon fussy period. "Giorgio C. How is he sleeping?" Gwen looked down at Roland, who was currently fighting sleep with the determination of someone twice his size and 10 times his age. She typed, "He's not. We're both operating on spite and stubbornness at this point. Giorgio C. That's normal for his age. You sound like you've done this before. Giorgio C. I have a niece. She didn't sleep through the night until she was 4 months old." Gwen found herself smiling at her phone, which felt dangerously close to something she shouldn't be doing. "Only 4 more months to go, then. Great. Giorgio C. You'll survive. Will I, though?" Giorgio C. Yes. The certainty in that single word settled something in her chest, like an anchor, like permission to believe that maybe, possibly, she would actually make it through this impossible phase. The texts became routine after that. Not daily, but regular enough that Gwen stopped being surprised when her phone lit up with his name. "Did you eat today?" he asked on Thursday. "Does coffee count as a meal?" she replied. Giorgio C. No. Then no. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at her door. A delivery person stood there holding a bag from a restaurant Gwen had never been able to afford. Real food. Warm. Prepared by someone who wasn't her. The note inside read, Eat. G. Gwen tried to feel manipulated. Tried to summon the suspicion Stephanie had planted. But all she felt was fed. Across the city, in an office that overlooked everything, Giorgio sat at a mahogany desk, while 3 men explained why a shipment had been delayed. Their reasons were weak. Excuses dressed up as explanations. Fix it, Giorgio said, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that made grown men reconsider their life choices. You have 48 hours. If the shipment isn't where it needs to be by then, I'll find people who can actually do their jobs. The men nodded quickly and left without another word. Vince, leaning against the doorframe, waited until they were gone before speaking. You're in a mood. I'm always in a mood, Giorgio replied, returning his attention to the documents in front of him. Numbers, territories, the endless logistics of running an empire that couldn't be discussed in polite company. Fair point. Vince moved into the office, closing the door behind him. But you've been different this week. Distracted. I'm not distracted. You checked your phone 6 times during that meeting. Giorgio looked up sharply. Your point? No point, Vince said mildly. Just an observation. Giorgio's phone buzzed on the desk. He reached for it automatically, then caught Vince's knowing look. Don't, Giorgio warned. Didn't say anything, Vince replied, but he was smiling. The message was from Gwen. No words, just a photo. Roland, wearing a onesie that said, I'm cute, Mom's exhausted. His tiny face scrunched up in what might have been a smile, or might have been gas. Below the photo, accidentally sent this to you instead of Stephanie. Apparently, I only know how to text the wrong people. Story of my life. Giorgio stared at the photo. At the tiny human who'd been crying himself hoarse just days ago. At the self-deprecating humor in Gwen's message that somehow made the exhaustion sound lighter. Something in his chest shifted, loosened. He caught himself smiling before he could stop it. Who is she? Vince asked quietly. Giorgio locked his phone and set it face down on the desk. No one. Boss, I've known you for 8 years. You don't smile at your phone for no one. Drop it, Vince. But Vince was right, and Giorgio knew it. Because somewhere between a misdirected text message and a photo of a baby in a ridiculous onesie, something had begun to shift. Something he hadn't felt in years. Something that felt dangerously close to caring. He picked up his phone again and typed a response. Giorgio C. He looks healthy. The reply came quickly. Gwen, thanks to you. Giorgio C. Thanks to you. You're the one taking care of him. Gwen, I'm the one keeping him alive. You're the one who made it possible. Giorgio stared at that message for longer than he should have. At the acknowledgement. At the gratitude that didn't feel like debt. Vince, he said without looking up. Clear my schedule for tomorrow afternoon. All of it? Yes. Mind if I ask why? Giorgio finally looked up, his expression unreadable but his decision already made. I need to check on something, he said simply. And if Vince noticed the slight softness in his boss's tone, he was smart enough not to mention it. Marcus showed up on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate somehow. Tuesdays were universally terrible days, not dramatic enough to be Monday, not hopeful enough to be Wednesday, just bland, disappointing Tuesdays. Gwen was coming back from the building's tiny laundry room, Roland strapped to her chest in the carrier, when she saw him leaning against her apartment door. He looked exactly the same. Same expensive haircut, same cologne she could smell from 10 feet away, same expression of casual entitlement that suggested the world existed to accommodate him. Her first instinct was to turn around and walk back downstairs. Her second was to check if the laundry room had a back exit. Her third was to remember that she lived here, and he was the one trespassing. She kept walking. "Gwen," Marcus said when she was close enough. He pushed off the door, hands in his pockets, trying for casual. "You look good." "I look exhausted," she corrected, fishing her keys from her pocket while keeping one hand on Roland. "What do you want, Marcus?" "That's cold. Can't I just want to see my son?" The possessive pronoun landed like a slap. "Your son," Gwen repeated slowly, "is someone you've never met. Someone you explicitly said you wanted nothing to do with. So no, you can't just want to see him." Marcus's smile tightened at the edges. "I've been thinking. Maybe I was too hasty. Maybe I should be part of his life." "Maybe you should leave," Gwen said, unlocking her door. But Marcus moved closer, his hand catching the door before she could close it. "We need to talk about custody. Visitation. My rights as a father." Something hot and furious flared in Gwen's chest. For weeks, she'd been running on empty, barely surviving, doing everything alone. And now he wanted to show up and claim rights? "Your rights?" Her voice came out sharper than intended. "You have no rights. You signed them away the night you told me to handle it myself and blocked my number." "I was scared," Marcus said, and had the audacity to look wounded. "I panicked. But I'm here now. I want to make this right." Roland shifted against her chest, making a small sound. Gwen's hand moved to support his head automatically, and the gesture seemed to remind Marcus that there was an actual baby involved in this conversation. "Let me see him," Marcus said, reaching toward Roland. "No." Gwen stepped back, her voice firm, not loud, not hysterical, just absolutely certain. "You don't get to walk away and then walk back in whenever it's convenient. I'm his father. You're a sperm donor." Gwen cut him off. "Fathers show up. Fathers help. Fathers don't disappear for 2 months and then show up demanding access like it's a Netflix subscription you forgot you had." Marcus's expression hardened. The fake warmth evaporated, leaving something colder underneath. "You're being unreasonable." "I'm being a parent. You should try it sometime." "This isn't over," Marcus said, his voice dropping to something that might have been threatening if Gwen wasn't already too angry to care. "I have rights. I'll get a lawyer if I have to." "Then get one," Gwen said. "But until you do, stay away from us." She stepped into her apartment and closed the door in his face, engaging all 3 locks with shaking hands. Through the door, she heard him mutter something that sounded like "bitch" before his footsteps retreated down the hallway. Gwen stood in her apartment, her heart hammering, Roland warm and oblivious against her chest. She'd done it. She'd actually stood up to Marcus. Hadn't caved. Hadn't let his manipulation work. It felt good. It also felt terrifying. Because Marcus didn't make empty threats. And if he actually followed through with lawyers and custody battles, she didn't have the money to fight him. Her phone buzzed. "Giorgio C? Everything all right?" Gwen stared at the message. They'd been texting for over a week now, but he'd never asked that specific question before. It was always about Roland, about practical things. This felt different, personal. She typed, "Define all right. Giorgio C. Did something happen?" Gwen hesitated, then decided exhaustion made honesty easier. "Roland's father showed up. Wants to suddenly be involved. I told him to leave." The response took longer this time. When it came, it was just 2 words. Giorgio C. His name. Gwen's thumb hovered over the keyboard. Something about the way he'd asked, calm, direct, but with an undercurrent she couldn't quite identify, made her pause. "Why?" "Giorgio C." Because men who abandon children and then show up making demands need to be reminded of boundaries. "I handled it," Giorgio C. I know you did, but I'd still like his name. There was something in that phrasing I'd like that made it feel less like a demand and more like a request, like he was asking permission rather than taking control. Gwen typed, Marcus Thompson. But seriously, I don't need you to do anything. I can handle him. Giorgio C. I know you can. That should have been the end of it. But 10 minutes later, her phone rang. Giorgio's name on the screen. She answered. Hello? Marcus Thompson, Giorgio said without preamble. Works for Sal Moretti. Gwen frowned, shifting Roland to her other shoulder. I don't know who that is. He's a rival of mine. Giorgio's voice was careful, controlled. Your ex showing up now, after weeks of silence, asking about custody that's not a coincidence. Something cold settled in Gwen's stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying that someone knows we've been in contact, and they're using your ex to get leverage. That's insane. How would anyone even know? Gwen stopped. Thought about the past week. The texts, the food deliveries, the fact that Giorgio Castelli had shown up at her apartment multiple times. In his world, people noticed things like that. This is my fault, Giorgio said quietly. I should have been more careful. I should have realized that helping you would put you on their radar. Stop, Gwen said, her voice firmer than she felt. You didn't do anything wrong. You helped me when I needed it. That's not something to apologize for. Silence on the line. Then, I'm sending protection. What? No. 2 men. They'll stay nearby, just in case Marcus or anyone else tries to make contact. Giorgio, I don't need bodyguards. Everyone needs protection. He cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. But I don't leave babies unprotected, especially not when the danger exists because of me. Gwen sat down slowly on her couch, Roland warm against her chest, trying to process what was happening. I accidentally texted you asking for formula. That's all this was supposed to be. I know. And now I'm apparently in the middle of some kind of mob war I didn't even know existed. I'm sorry, Giorgio said, and he sounded like he meant it. But I won't let anyone use you or Roland to get to me. The men I'm sending, they're discreet. You won't even notice them most of the time. And if I say no, then I'll respect that, Giorgio said. But I'm asking you not to. There it was again. Asking. Not demanding. Not controlling. Just requesting that she let him help. Gwen closed her eyes. Thought about Marcus's face in her hallway. About the cold way he'd looked at her when she'd refused him. About the fact that she was completely alone in this apartment with a newborn baby and no backup plan. Okay, she said quietly. But I'm not happy about it. You don't have to be happy, Giorgio replied. You just have to be safe. After they hung up, Gwen sat in the quiet apartment, watching Roland sleep against her chest. His face was peaceful, completely unaware that his mother had somehow stumbled into a situation that belonged in movies, not real life. Her phone buzzed again. Giorgio C. The men will be in place within the hour. If you need anything at all, you call me. Understood? Gwen looked at the message for a long moment. At the care embedded in that demand. At the way he'd said, I don't leave babies unprotected like it was a fundamental law of his universe. She typed back, understood. And for the first time since Marcus had appeared at her door, she felt something close to safe, not because she was weak, not because she needed rescuing, but because someone was watching. Someone who'd shown up when she needed help and kept showing up ever since. Someone she was starting to trust. Despite every warning she'd been given, Gwen looked down at Roland and whispered, Your mom is either making the best decision or the worst mistake of her life. I really hope it's the first one. Roland yawned and stretched, completely unbothered. Outside her window, Two men in dark coats took position at opposite ends of her street. And across the city, in an office overlooking everything, Giorgio made a phone call that would ensure Marcus Thompson understood exactly what happened to men who threatened things that didn't belong to them. Giorgio showed up on Thursday evening with takeout and no warning. Gwen answered the door in sweatpants and a shirt that had spit up on the shoulder. She'd stopped noticing these things around day 3 of motherhood and found him standing there with bags that smelled like actual food prepared by professionals. "You can't keep feeding me," she said, even as she stepped aside to let him in. "I can," he replied simply, setting the bags on her counter. "And I will. That's not... I appreciate it, but you've done enough." Gwen gestured vaguely at her apartment, at the formula stocked in her cabinet, at the fact that she'd eaten real meals for the past week. "You don't have to keep checking on us." Giorgio turned to look at her, his dark eyes steady. "I know I don't have to. I want to." The simplicity of that statement shouldn't have made her stomach flutter, but it did anyway. Roland chose that moment to start fussing from his spot in the bassinet, and Gwen moved automatically to pick him up. "Let me," Giorgio said, crossing the small space in 3 strides. Gwen watched as he lifted Roland with practiced ease, cradling him against his chest with one hand supporting his head, the other supporting his small body. Roland made a sound half protest, half curiosity, and turned his face into Giorgio's shirt. "He's going to drool on your very expensive suit," Gwen warned. "It's just a suit," Giorgio said, his attention on Roland. He swayed slightly, that universal motion that parents and non-parents alike somehow knew to do with babies. "Aren't you, Roland? You don't care about expensive things. You just want to be held." Roland made another sound, softer this time, and his tiny hand found Giorgio's tie. Gwen should have been focused on unpacking the food. Instead, she found herself watching the way Giorgio moved with her son. Gentle, patient. Like holding a baby was the most natural thing in the world for a man who commanded fear with a look. "You're really good with him," she said quietly. "I've had practice." "Your niece?" Giorgio nodded, still swaying. "Sophia. She's 7 now, but I remember when she was this small, when the smallest things felt impossible." There was something in his voice, a softness that didn't match the hard edges everyone else saw. Gwen moved to the couch and sat down, tucking her legs underneath her. "Tell me about her," she said. Giorgio looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Why?" "Because I've heard what everyone says about you. The dangerous man who runs half the city. But I've never heard about the uncle who holds babies like they're precious." She paused. "I'd like to know about that person." For a long moment, Giorgio just looked at her. Then he moved to sit in the chair across from her, still holding Roland. "Sophia's mother, my sister, she had her young," he began. "No father in the picture. No support system. I helped where I could, but I was building my business then. I wasn't always available. But you showed up when it mattered," Gwen guessed. "I tried." His hand moved across Roland's back in slow circles. "Sophia used to have nightmares. She'd wake up screaming, and her mother would be so exhausted she couldn't calm her down fast enough. So I'd come over, hold her until she fell back asleep." Gwen's chest tightened at the image. "That's why you're so good at this." "That's why I understand what it's like," Giorgio corrected. "To be a single parent. To feel like you're drowning and everyone's just watching from the shore." The honesty in his voice made something shift in the air between them. Less guarded, more real. "My brother would have been good at this too," Giorgio said quietly, his eyes still on Roland. "Better than me, probably." He was softer, kinder. The past tense registered immediately. Gwen's breath caught. "Was?" "Antonio." Giorgio's jaw tightened slightly. "He was younger, 16 when he died. Wrong place, wrong time, Wrong people who thought shooting a kid would send a message. Giorgio, I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago, he said, though the weight in his voice suggested time hadn't made it lighter. But it's why I do what I do now. Why I built the protections I have. Why I don't tolerate threats against children. Understanding clicked into place. All of it. The way he'd shown up without hesitation. The way he'd asked about Roland before anything else. The absolute certainty in his voice when he'd said, I don't leave babies unprotected. He would have been an uncle, Gwen said softly. Your brother. Giorgio looked up at her, and something in his expression cracked open. Just for a moment. Just enough for her to see the grief underneath. Yes, he said simply. Roland had fallen asleep against his chest, tiny face, peaceful, one small fist clutching Giorgio's tie like a lifeline. Gwen stood slowly and moved to sit on the arm of Giorgio's chair, looking down at her sleeping son. He trusts you, she whispered. Roland, he doesn't do that with many people. He's a good judge of character, Giorgio replied, and there was the slightest hint of amusement in his voice. Or he's 3 weeks old and can't judge anything yet, Gwen countered. That too, she laughed quietly, so she wouldn't wake Roland and caught the way Giorgio's mouth curved upward. Not quite a smile, but close. Closer than she'd seen before. You should do that more often, she said without thinking. Do what? Almost smile. It suits you. Giorgio's eyes met hers, and suddenly the distance between them felt very small. He was close enough that she could see the different shades of brown in his irises, could smell his cologne mixed with the baby powder scent that now clung to everyone who held Roland. You make it easier, he said quietly. Make what easier? Forgetting the rest of it. The business. The violence. All the things I do that I can't undo. His gaze held hers. When I'm here, with you and Roland, it's just simpler. Gwen's heart did something complicated in her chest. That's because we're boring. Our most exciting activity is trying to figure out if that sound he made was gas or actual contentment. It was gas, Giorgio said. How do you know? Because content sounds different, more settled. That was definitely gas. Gwen laughed again, and this time Giorgio's almost smile became an actual one. Small, brief, but real. Roland stirred slightly, his face scrunching up, and then impossibly his mouth curved into what might have been a smile. Did he just? Gwen started. He smiled. Giorgio confirmed, his voice dropping to something amazed. Look at that. The books say it's probably just gas. It's not gas, Giorgio said with absolute certainty. He shifted slightly, bringing his face closer to Roland's. Then, without warning, he made a face eyebrows raised, mouth in an exaggerated O. Roland's eyes opened slightly, focused on Giorgio, and then clearly, unmistakably, smiled again. A real smile. The first one Gwen had ever seen. Oh my God, she breathed. He actually smiled at you. He has excellent taste, Giorgio said, making the face again. This time, Roland made a sound that was almost a giggle. Not quite, but close enough to make Gwen's heart squeeze. I can't believe this, she said, leaning closer to see Roland's face better. His first smile, and it's not even for me. It's for you. He's known me less time. I'm still novel, Giorgio said, but there was something warm in his voice. Something that sounded dangerously close to affection. Gwen found herself inches from Giorgio's shoulder, close enough that if she shifted slightly, she'd be pressed against him. The thought came automatically. I feel safe when he's here. Not because she was weak, not because she needed saving, but because Giorgio showed up. Because he held her son like he was precious. Because he'd lost his own brother and decided that meant protecting other people's children. Because underneath all the danger and power and violence that made up his world, there was a man who made funny faces to make babies smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For all of this. For showing up when you didn't have to. For caring when no one else did." Giorgio turned his head slightly, and suddenly they were very close. His eyes searched hers, and Gwen forgot how to breathe. "It's not hard to care about you, Gwen," he said, his voice low and certain. The air between them felt charged, significant, like standing at the edge of something she couldn't name but felt in her chest. Roland made another sound, definitely gas this time, and the moment broke. Giorgio looked back down at the baby, his expression softening again. "He's going to need changing soon." "Probably," Gwen agreed, not moving. "You should eat while he's sleeping." "I should," but neither of them moved. They just sat there, close together in the small apartment, with a sleeping baby between them and something unnamed but undeniable growing in the space where fear used to be. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, in broad daylight, while Gwen was walking back from the corner store with Roland strapped to her chest. She'd only gone 2 blocks, just needed diapers and milk, had convinced herself that Giorgio's guards were being overly cautious, that Marcus wouldn't actually try anything, that she was safe in her own neighborhood in the middle of the day. She was wrong. The black SUV pulled up alongside her so smoothly she almost didn't notice it, almost kept walking. But something made her glance over some instinct that had been sharpened by weeks of being on edge. 2 men got out, neither one bothered with pretense. "Miss Thompson," the taller one said, his voice polite in a way that made her skin crawl. "We need you to come with us." Gwen's hand immediately went to Roland's back, protective and automatic. "I don't think so." "It wasn't a request," the second man said, moving to block her path. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud enough that she was sure they could hear it. The street wasn't empty, there were people walking, cars passing, but everyone seemed suddenly very far away. "I'm not going anywhere," Gwen said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And you need to back off." The tall man sighed like she was being inconvenient. "We don't want to hurt you. We just need the baby." The words landed like ice water. "The baby is leverage," the second man added, almost conversationally. "Nothing personal, but Castelli cares about you and the kid, which means Moretti can use you. Simple business." Gwen took a step backward, both hands now wrapped around Roland. "You're not touching him. Don't make this difficult," the tall man said, reaching for her. Gwen screamed. Not a polite scream, not a startled one. The kind of scream that came from every maternal instinct she possessed, raw and desperate and loud enough to shatter glass. "Help! Someone help!" The tall man's hand closed around her arm, pulling hard. Gwen twisted away, curling her body around Roland, using herself as a shield. She felt the pavement scrape her knees as she fell, felt Roland start crying against her chest, felt hands grabbing at her shoulders. "Let her go!" Someone shouted, a voice she didn't recognize. Gunshots cracked through the air. Gwen pressed herself against the ground, covering Roland's head with both hands, her entire world narrowing to keeping him safe. She could hear shouting, the sound of bodies hitting concrete, more gunshots that made her ears ring. Then strong hands were on her shoulders, different hands, gentler, pulling her upright. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to move," a man said urgently. She recognized him vaguely, one of Giorgio's guards, the one who'd been stationed across the street. "Can you walk?" Gwen nodded, though her legs felt like water. The guard Marco, she remembered, kept one hand on her elbow, guiding her toward a car that had appeared out of nowhere. Behind them, she could hear the violent sounds of the confrontation still happening. Breaking glass, shouting, the sick sound of fists hitting flesh. "Roland!" she gasped, her hands checking him frantically. "Is he?" "He's crying, which means he's breathing." Marco said, opening the car door. Get in. Boss is 2 minutes out. Gwen slid into the back seat, her entire body shaking. Roland was screaming now, full lunged, terrified screaming that she'd never heard from him before. It's okay, baby, she whispered, her voice breaking. You're okay. Mama's here. You're safe. But he wasn't safe. Neither of them were, because she'd convinced herself that a trip to the corner store was harmless, that the danger wasn't real, that she could handle this on her own. The car door on the other side opened, and suddenly Giorgio was there. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, taking in her scraped knees, her shaking hands, Roland screaming, and something in his expression cracked open. Are you hurt? His voice was rough, barely controlled. I don't know, Gwen stammered. They tried to take him. They said he was leverage, and they tried to... Giorgio reached for her, pulling her against his chest with a gentleness that contradicted the fury in his eyes. One arm wrapped around her, the other cupped the back of Roland's head. You're safe now, he said into her hair. Both of you. I've got you. Gwen pressed her face against his shoulder and felt something inside her break. All the fear she'd been holding back, all the terror of those hands grabbing at her. At Roland, it came out in shaking sobs she couldn't control. I'm sorry, she gasped. I thought I just went to the store. I thought it was safe. This isn't your fault, Giorgio said fiercely. None of this is your fault. They wanted Roland, she whispered. They were going to take him. Giorgio's arms tightened around both of them. No one takes him. No one. Do you understand me? Through the car window, Gwen could see Marco talking to another guard, both of them looking tense. The 2 men who'd tried to grab her were on the ground, unmoving. She looked away quickly. Did they? Are they? They're alive, Giorgio said. But they won't forget what happens when you threaten things that belong to me. Gwen should have been frightened by the cold certainty in his voice, should have been reminded that this man was dangerous, that his world was violent, that she'd stumbled into something she didn't understand. But all she felt was safe. Roland's cries had softened to whimpers. Gwen pulled back slightly to check him over, running her hands across his small body, looking for any sign of injury. He's fine, Giorgio said quietly. You protected him. I didn't do anything, Gwen said, her voice breaking again. I just screamed and fell. That's not protecting. You put yourself between him and danger, Giorgio interrupted. You used your body as a shield. That's everything. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. The gesture was so tender it made her chest ache. You're not going back to that apartment, he said. Not a question, a statement. Giorgio, you're not safe there. Not anymore. His eyes held hers, dark and intense and absolutely certain. You and Roland are coming with me, somewhere secure, somewhere they can't reach you. I can't just move into your place, Gwen protested weakly. We barely know each other. I can't. You don't walk home alone anymore, Giorgio said, his voice firm but not harsh. You don't fight alone anymore. You don't face this by yourself because you're too stubborn to accept help. I'm not stubborn. You're terrified and exhausted and trying to do everything on your own because that's what you've had to do. His hand was still on her face, anchoring her. But you don't have to anymore. Let me protect you. Both of you. Gwen looked down at Roland, who had finally stopped crying, and was staring up at her with wide, exhausted eyes. She thought about her apartment, the 3rd-floor walk-up with thin walls and a broken lock she'd been meaning to fix. She thought about the corner store 2 blocks away that suddenly felt like a war zone. She thought about how she'd felt when those hands grabbed her. How her only thought had been, not Roland, not my baby, please not him. Okay, she whispered. Giorgio's expression shifted relief, and something else she couldn't quite name. Okay? Okay, she repeated, stronger this time. But I'm not a prisoner. If I want to leave, then you leave, Giorgio said immediately. This is protection, Gwen, not a cage. You can go whenever you want, but I'm asking you to stay long enough to let me keep you safe. Gwen nodded slowly, her arms tightening around Roland. How long is long enough? Until the threat is gone, Giorgio said. His jaw tightened. Which, after today, won't be long. There was something in his voice cold, final, that told Gwen exactly what he meant, what he was going to do to the people who'd tried to take her son. She should have been horrified, should have protested, should have demanded he handle this through legal channels and proper authorities. But all she felt was grateful. Thank you, she said quietly, for having people watching, for getting here so fast, for, her voice broke, for caring. Giorgio's hand moved from her face to the back of her neck, pulling her forward until their foreheads touched. Roland was pressed between them, safe and warm and protected. You don't thank someone for caring about you, Giorgio said, his voice rough with emotion. That's not how this works. Then how does it work? Gwen asked. His eyes met hers, dark and serious and full of something that made her heart stutter. You trust me, he said simply. And I keep showing up. Gwen looked at him, at this dangerous man who'd shown up for a misdirected text and kept showing up ever since. Who held her baby like he was precious. Who'd just wrapped his arms around both of them like they were the most important thing in his world. I do, she whispered. Trust you, I mean. Something in Giorgio's expression softened. Then let's get you home. Where's home? Gwen asked. Wherever you and Roland are safe, Giorgio replied. Starting now. The penthouse was nothing like Gwen's apartment. Where hers had water stains and thin walls, this had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Where hers had a single broken chair, this had furniture that looked like it belonged in magazines she couldn't afford. Marble floors, glass tables, art on the walls that was probably worth more than she'd earn in her entire life. Gwen stood in the entrance, holding Roland against her chest, and felt completely out of place. This is too much, she said quietly. Giorgio set down the bag he'd been carrying, the hastily packed collection of her and Roland's essentials. It's just a place. It's a palace, Gwen corrected. I'm going to break something. Or Roland's going to spit up on something that costs more than a car. Then we'll clean it, Giorgio said simply. He moved past her, gesturing for her to follow. Come. I'll show you your room. Your room. Not the guest room or where you'll be staying. Just hers. Gwen followed him through the expansive living space, trying not to stare at everything. The kitchen with its gleaming appliances, the dining table that could seat 12, the hallway lined with doors she couldn't begin to guess the purpose of. Giorgio stopped at a door near the end of the hall and pushed it open. The room inside was large, larger than her entire apartment had been. A king-sized bed dominated one wall, dressed in soft linens that looked like they'd never known the existence of a washing machine coin slot. But what made Gwen's breath catch wasn't the bed. It was the corner, where a white crib stood, already assembled, with soft blankets draped over the rail. A changing table stocked with diapers and wipes. A small dresser with what looked like new baby clothes folded neatly on top. And against the wall, a bottle warmer plugged in and ready. Gwen walked slowly toward the setup, her throat tightening. When did you? She started, then stopped. You did this before we came here. Yes, Giorgio said from the doorway. Before I agreed to move in. Yes. Gwen turned to look at him. You were that sure I'd say yes? No, Giorgio said quietly. But I was that sure I'd ask. And if you agreed, I wanted you to know you were welcome. That Roland was welcome. Something in Gwen's chest cracked open. She looked back at the crib, at the careful preparation, at the thought that had gone into making space for a baby he had no obligation to. "The bottles are the same brand you use," Giorgio continued, "and I wasn't sure about the formula, so there are 3 kinds in the kitchen." Marco's wife said the bottle warmer was essential, something about 3 a.m. feedings being hard enough without waiting for water to heat. Gwen's eyes burned. "You talked to Marco's wife about this?" "She has experience I don't," Giorgio said simply. "I wanted to get it right." Gwen sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, still holding Roland, who was somehow sleeping through this entire conversation. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. That's not—" She stopped, looking down at her son. "People don't do this. They don't just make space for strangers and their babies like it's nothing." "You're not strangers," Giorgio said, and the certainty in his voice made her look up. "Not anymore." Their eyes met across the room, and Gwen felt something shift, something that had been building since that first night when he'd shown up with formula, since he'd held Roland like he mattered, since he'd wrapped his arms around both of them in that car and promised they were safe. "Thank you," she whispered. Giorgio nodded once, then stepped back toward the door. "I'll let you settle in, if you need anything." "I'll ask," Gwen finished. "I know." He paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. "You're safe here, Gwen. Both of you. I need you to believe that." "I do," she said, and meant it. The first few days were an adjustment. Gwen woke up in a bed that didn't creak, in a room that didn't share walls with neighbors who fought at 2 a.m. She fed Roland in a chair by the window, watching the city wake up stories below, and tried to reconcile this reality with the one she'd been living just days ago. Giorgio gave her space, didn't hover, didn't make her feel like a guest in his home. He worked from his office most days, the door closed, his voice occasionally audible through the walls when he was on phone calls she definitely wasn't supposed to hear. But in the mornings, he was there. The first time Gwen walked into the kitchen to find him making coffee, she'd frozen in the doorway. "I didn't know you cooked," she'd said. "I don't cook," Giorgio had replied, sliding a cup toward her. "I make coffee and order food. Those are my 2 skills." "Impressive range," Gwen had said, taking the cup. The coffee was perfect, strong but not bitter. Exactly how she liked it, though she'd never told him. He'd noticed anyway. These morning moments became routine. Gwen would settle Roland in the portable bassinet Giorgio had acquired from somewhere, and they'd sit at the kitchen island with their coffee, talking about nothing important. The weather, the news, how Roland had slept, or more accurately, hadn't slept. "He's getting better," Gwen said one morning, watching Roland wave his tiny fists in the air. "Only woke up twice last night." "That's progress," Giorgio said. "From 4 times, yes. From sleeping through the night, not so much." She took a sip of coffee. "Do you ever sleep?" "Sometimes." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have," Giorgio said, but there was something almost amused in his expression. Gwen studied him over her cup. "You're different here. Less." "Dangerous?" he offered. "I was going to say serious, but dangerous works too." "I'm still both," Giorgio said quietly. "I'm just not those things with you." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted and significant. "Why?" Gwen asked. Giorgio's eyes met hers. "Because you don't need me to be." The late-night talks started by accident. Gwen had been up with Roland another round of the 3 a.m. feeding ritual when she'd heard movement in the kitchen. She'd found Giorgio there, also awake, staring at his laptop with the kind of intensity that suggested the numbers on screen weren't cooperating. "Can't sleep either?" she'd asked. He'd looked up, seeming almost surprised to see her. "Work," he'd said simply. "At 3 in the morning? Business doesn't keep traditional hours." Gwen had sat down across from him, Roland drowsy in her arms. "Neither does parenting." They'd talked until Roland fell back asleep. About nothing. About everything. About how Giorgio had started in this business young, too young because his family needed protection and money and someone willing to make hard choices. "Do you regret it?" Gwen had asked. "Every day," Giorgio had said. "And not at all." That's a contradiction. Most truths are. These conversations became their own kind of routine. Nights when they'd both be awake for different reasons, ending up in the kitchen or the living room, talking until one of them finally admitted exhaustion. It was during one of these talks that Gwen realized she'd never felt this comfortable with anyone. Not her ex, not even Stephanie, who knew almost everything about her. With Giorgio, she could just be. Exhausted and honest and messy and real. "I've never had this before," she admitted one night, when it was just them and the city lights and Roland sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Had what?" Giorgio asked. "Someone who shows up." Gwen looked down at Roland, her fingers tracing his tiny features. "Marcus made promises, said he'd be there. But the second things got hard, he left. And before him, there were other guys who said the right things but never actually stayed." She looked up at Giorgio, finding him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've never felt chosen before," she said quietly. "Not really. Not like this. Not like someone actually wanted me around, baby and all the mess that comes with it." Giorgio set down the glass he'd been holding, stood slowly, crossed the distance between them until he was close enough that she could see the different shades of brown in his eyes. "You are chosen," he said, his voice low and certain. "Every day, every moment you're here. That's not going to change." Gwen's heart hammered in her chest. Giorgio. He reached out, his hand cupping her face with the gentleness she'd come to expect from him. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and Gwen forgot how to breathe. They were so close. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could smell his cologne, could see the way his gaze dropped to her mouth. This was it, the moment. The kiss that had been building between them for weeks. But then Roland shifted in her arms, making a small sound, and reality snapped back into place. Giorgio stepped back, his hand dropping, his expression shifting to something more controlled. "You should sleep," he said quietly. "While he's sleeping." "Right," Gwen managed, her voice barely steady. "Sleep. Good idea." She stood, cradling Roland carefully, and moved toward the hallway. At the door, she paused and looked back. Giorgio was watching her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes full of something that made her chest ache. "Good night, Giorgio," she whispered. "Good night, Gwen." She went to her room, in his home, where he'd made space for her and her son, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her heart was still racing. Her lips still tingled with anticipation of a kiss that hadn't happened. And somewhere in the living room, she knew Giorgio was awake too, probably thinking the same thing. They'd almost crossed a line tonight, and Gwen realized, as she finally drifted towards sleep, that she wanted to cross it. Wanted to know what it felt like to be kissed by someone who showed up, who chose her, who made space in his dangerous, complicated world for her and her baby. Soon, she promised herself. But not yet. Not until she was sure this was real, that he meant it, that choosing her wasn't just about protection or obligation or some misplaced sense of duty. She needed it to be real, because she was already falling, and if she fell, she needed to know he'd catch her. It was raining the night everything changed. Gwen stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room, watching water stream down the glass, distorting the city lights into abstract patterns. Roland was asleep in his crib, actually asleep, for more than an hour straight, which felt like a minor miracle. She should have been sleeping too, taking advantage of the quiet, but her mind wouldn't settle. "You're thinking too loud," Giorgio's voice came from behind her. Gwen turned to find him standing in the doorway, still dressed despite the late hour. His tie was loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and he looked tired in a way she rarely saw. "Bad habit," she said, attempting lightness. "My thoughts have no volume control." Giorgio moved into the room, stopping a few feet away. Close enough to talk quietly, far enough to maintain the distance they'd been carefully preserving since that almost kiss. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Gwen looked back at the rain-streaked window. "That text message, the one I sent you by accident. What about it?" "You could have ignored it," she said quietly. "You could have deleted it and never thought about it again. But you didn't. You showed up, and I've never understood why." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of rain against glass. "You want to know why I came?" Giorgio asked finally. "Yes." He moved closer, until he was standing beside her at the window. Their reflections overlapped in the glass, two people who shouldn't have fit together but somehow did. "I remembered you," Giorgio said. "From the bakery, months before that text. You were doing their books, sitting in the corner with cold coffee and a laptop that kept freezing." Gwen blinked. "You remember that?" "Everyone in that bakery changed when I walked in. Got quiet, got nervous, moved differently." His eyes met hers in the reflection. "Except you. You looked up, said good afternoon like I was anyone else, and went back to your work, like I didn't make you afraid." "I didn't know who you were then," Gwen said. "But you weren't afraid after either," Giorgio countered. "Even when you realized, even when everyone warned you, you were careful, yes, cautious, but not afraid." He turned to face her directly, and Gwen did the same. "When I got that text," Giorgio continued, "that screenshot of your bank account showing $4 and a message begging for $35 to feed your baby, I could have ignored it. Should have, probably. It wasn't my problem. Wasn't my responsibility." "Then why didn't you?" Gwen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I recognized something in that message," Giorgio said. "Something I'd seen before in people who survived things they shouldn't have. Strength that comes from having no other choice. Fight that comes from protecting something more important than yourself." His hand came up, hovering near her face, but not quite touching. "You could have given up," he said quietly. "Could have called your ex and let him hurt you again with his indifference. Could have asked your friend for money you both knew she didn't have. Could have made any number of choices that would have been easier than accidentally texting a stranger." "Texting you wasn't a choice," Gwen said. "It was a mistake." "No," Giorgio said firmly. "Sending that text was an accident. But not deleting it immediately, not running when I showed up, not giving up when everything got harder, those were choices. Your choices. And they showed me exactly who you are." Gwen's throat tightened. "Who am I?" "Someone who loves her son more than she fears the world," Giorgio said. "Someone who stands up to her ex when he shows up demanding things he hasn't earned. Someone who shields her baby with her own body when men try to take him." His hand finally made contact, cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "Someone worth showing up for," he finished. Every single time. Something broke loose in Gwen's chest. All the fear she'd been holding, all the exhaustion, all the weeks of trying to be strong enough for both herself and Roland, it cracked open. "I'm so tired," she whispered, and her voice broke on the words. "I'm so tired of doing this alone, of being scared, of wondering if I'm enough." "Gwen, and then you showed up," she continued, tears spilling over now. "You just kept showing up, with formula and food and protection and space for us in your home. And I don't understand it. I don't understand why you care." "Because you matter," Giorgio said simply, his thumb brushing away her tears. "You and Roland. You matter to me." "Why?" Gwen asked, her voice raw. We're nobody. We're just— You're not nobody, Giorgio interrupted, his voice fierce despite its softness. You're someone who fought for her child when the world made it impossible. You're someone who asked for help, even though it terrified you. You're someone who sees past what I do and sees who I am. His forehead touched hers, and Gwen's breath caught. Let me be the one who shows up, Gwen, he said quietly. Not because you need saving, not because I pity you, but because when I'm with you and Roland, I remember what I'm protecting, why any of this matters. Gwen's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling his heartbeat under her palms. Steady, strong, real. I'm falling for you, she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I'm falling for you, and it terrifies me because everyone who's ever mattered has left, and I don't think I could survive it if you did too. Giorgio's other hand came up to frame her face, holding her like she was something precious. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. I'm not Marcus. I'm not the people who taught you that love means leaving. I show up, Gwen. That's what I do. That's what I'll keep doing. Promise, Gwen whispered. I promise. And then he kissed her. It wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate or hungry or demanding. It was slow and intentional, and full of everything they'd been building toward since that first night when he'd appeared at her door with formula. His lips were soft against hers, gentle in a way that contradicted everything she'd heard about him. His hands cradled her face like she might break, and Gwen melted into him, her fingers clutching his shirt, anchoring herself to this moment. The kiss deepened gradually, naturally, like they had all the time in the world. Like this was just the beginning of something neither of them wanted to rush. When they finally pulled apart, Giorgio rested his forehead against hers again, both of them breathing a little harder. I've wanted to do that for weeks, he admitted quietly. Gwen laughed a soft, slightly shaky sound. Why didn't you? Because I needed you to know it wasn't about gratitude or obligation or some misguided sense of protection. His eyes opened, meeting hers. I needed you to know this is real, that you're choosing this, choosing me. I am, Gwen said, her voice steady despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. Choosing you, I mean. I am. Giorgio smiled a real smile, the kind she'd only seen glimpses of before, and kissed her again. Softer this time, briefer. A promise rather than a question. Come here, he said, guiding her to the couch. They sat down together, and Giorgio pulled her against his side, his arm around her shoulders. Gwen tucked herself into him, feeling safe in a way she'd never experienced before. Tell me something, she said after a moment of comfortable silence. That night you came. The first night. You could have just sent someone with the formula, but you came yourself. Why? Giorgio was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing absent patterns on her shoulder. Because I needed to see, he said finally. Needed to know if what I heard in that message was real. If you were real. And you opened the door looking exhausted and terrified and still ready to fight if you needed to, Giorgio said. You apologized for a mistake while holding your baby like he was the only thing that mattered in the world. And I thought, this is someone worth knowing, worth protecting, worth showing up for. Gwen tilted her head to look up at him. You decided all that in 30 seconds? I decided all that before I knocked on your door, Giorgio corrected. The 30 seconds just confirmed it. What if I'd been terrible? Gwen asked. What if I'd been manipulative or using you or— You weren't, Giorgio said simply. And I knew you wouldn't be. People who are truly desperate don't have energy left for manipulation. They just survive. And you were surviving. I'm doing better than surviving now, Gwen said quietly. Yes, Giorgio agreed. You are. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the rain, until Gwen felt herself starting to drift towards sleep. Real sleep. The kind that came from feeling safe and chosen and held. Stay, Giorgio said softly, as if reading her thoughts. Sleep here. I'll wake you, if Roland needs you. You don't have to. I want to, he interrupted gently. Let me hold you while you rest. Just this once. Gwen didn't argue. Didn't protest about independence or self-sufficiency or any of the things she'd clung to for so long. She just nodded and let herself relax completely against him. As she drifted off, she heard Giorgio's voice, quiet and certain. I've got you. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Gwen believed it. 5 months later, on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, Roland took his first steps. Gwen was sitting on the living room floor, folding laundry, the expensive kind that didn't come from discount stores anymore but still needed folding because some things didn't change no matter how much your life did. Roland was playing nearby, pulling himself up on the coffee table with the determined expression he got when he was concentrating. Mama, he babbled, which wasn't quite a word but was close enough to make Gwen's heart squeeze every time. I see you, baby, she said, smiling at him. You're getting so strong. The penthouse door opened, and Giorgio walked in, loosening his tie. He'd been in meetings all morning, the kind where he wore his dangerous face and made grown men reconsider their life choices. But the moment he saw Roland, that face softened into something else entirely. There's my boy, Giorgio said, setting down his briefcase. And that's when it happened. Roland let go of the coffee table, wobbled, found his balance, and took one step, then another, then 3 more, walking straight toward Giorgio with his arms outstretched and the biggest smile on his tiny face. Oh my God, Gwen breathed, frozen in place. Giorgio, But Giorgio was already moving, dropping to his knees and opening his arms just as Roland stumbled the last few steps and fell forward into them. Did you see that? Giorgio's voice was filled with wonder as he caught Roland, lifting him up. Did you see our son walk? Our son. The words hung in the air, casual and certain, like they'd always been true. Gwen felt tears prick her eyes. Not sad tears, not overwhelmed tears, just full tears. The kind that came from watching the man she loved hold her baby, their baby, and claim him with 2 simple words. I saw, she managed, her voice thick. He walked right to you. Smart boy, Giorgio said, kissing Roland's forehead. You knew exactly where you were going, didn't you? Roland laughed, that pure, delighted baby laugh that made everything else in the world seem insignificant, and grabbed Giorgio's face with both hands. Gwen stood slowly, crossing to where they were, and Giorgio pulled her in with his free arm. The 3 of them stood there in the middle of the living room, wrapped together, while Roland babbled happily about his achievement. He walked, Gwen said, looking up at Giorgio. Our son walked. She said it deliberately, testing the words, claiming them. Giorgio's eyes met hers, dark and warm, and full of love, that still made her breath catch even after months of seeing it every day. Yes, he said simply. He did. That evening, after Roland was asleep in his crib, the crib he'd long since outgrown the guest room label for Gwen, found herself standing at the same window where everything had changed months ago. The city looked different now, less overwhelming, less foreign, more like home. Giorgio appeared beside her, 2 glasses of wine in hand. He offered her one, and she took it, their fingers brushing in a touch that still sent warmth through her. You're thinking again, he observed. I'm always thinking, Gwen said. You should be used to it by now. I am. Doesn't mean I'm not curious about what goes on in there. Gwen took a sip of wine, gathering her thoughts. I was thinking about that night. The text message. How I almost deleted it before sending. How I panicked when I realized what I'd done. I remember, Giorgio said quietly. If I'd been more careful, if I'd double-checked the contact, if any single thing had been different, we wouldn't be here. She looked at him. Roland wouldn't have you. I wouldn't have you. We would have found each other eventually, Giorgio said with certainty. You can't know that. Yes, I can. He set down his glass and turned to face her fully. Because some things are meant to happen. Some people are meant to find each other, even if the path there makes no sense. Gwen smiled. That's very romantic for a man who runs a criminal empire. I contain multitudes, Giorgio said, deadpan, and Gwen laughed. You really do. She set down her own glass and moved closer to him, her hands resting on his chest. Through the expensive shirt, the kind she'd once been terrified Roland would ruin, she could feel his heartbeat. Steady, strong. Here. I used to think miracles came with halos, she said quietly. With trumpets and angels and obvious signs from the universe. I thought they'd be easy to recognize. Clear. Undeniable. And now? Giorgio asked, his arms circling her waist. Now I know that sometimes miracles show up at 2 a.m. holding baby formula, Gwen said. Sometimes they arrive in expensive suits and dangerous reputations. Sometimes they look nothing like what you expected, and everything like what you needed. Giorgio's hand came up to cup her face. You're my miracle too, you know. I'm just a single mom who can't work her phone contacts, Gwen said, but her voice was soft. You're the woman who reminded me why I do what I do, Giorgio corrected. Why protection matters. Why family matters. Why showing up is the most important thing anyone can do. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then her temple, then finally her lips. Soft and sweet and full of promise. I love you, he said against her mouth. You and Roland, my family. Gwen's throat tightened. They'd said those words before, late at night, in quiet moments, in the safety of darkness. But something about hearing them now, after watching Roland walk into Giorgio's arms, after months of building this life together, made them feel more real than ever. I love you too, she whispered. So much it scares me sometimes. Don't be scared, Giorgio said. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? Promise. They stood there, wrapped in each other, while the city glittered below them. Gwen thought about the apartment she'd left behind, the one with thin walls and broken locks and the constant fear of not being enough. She thought about Marcus, who'd shown up demanding rights he'd never earned and then disappeared again when Giorgio's people made it clear he wasn't welcome. She thought about Stephanie, who'd been wrong about debts and leverage but right about one thing. Giorgio Castelli wasn't a man who gave anything for free. But some debts weren't owed in fear. Some debts were repaid in love, in showing up, in making space, in calling someone else's child our son like it was the simplest truth in the world. Come to bed, Giorgio said softly. Before Roland wakes up and we lose our chance at actual sleep. Gwen let him lead her toward the bedroom, their bedroom now, with her clothes in the closet and her books on the nightstand, and her life tangled so completely with his that she couldn't remember where one ended and the other began. In the nursery, Roland slept peacefully, dreaming baby dreams about walking and playing and being loved by 2 people who would move mountains to keep him safe. And in the morning, they'd do it all again. The coffee, the breakfast, the ordinary magic of being a family. Not a traditional family. Not the kind that came from bloodlines or legal documents or any of the usual ways, but a family made, not found. Built from a mistake that turned into a miracle. From a text message sent in desperation and answered with kindness. From a man who could have ignored her but didn't. From a woman who could have given up but wouldn't. From a baby who needed love and found it in the most unexpected place. As Gwen drifted toward sleep, tucked against Giorgio's side with his arm around her and the sound of Roland's soft breathing through the baby monitor, she thought about debt one last time. She'd started this owing $35 for formula. She'd ended it with everything that mattered. And somewhere in the math of the universe, that felt exactly right. Epilogue. 6 months later. Again! Roland shrieked, running across the living room on legs that had gotten steadier with each passing day. Giorgio caught him mid-run, lifting him into the air while Roland squealed with delight. Again! You're going to wear me out, buddy. Again! Again! Roland insisted, because at 13 months old, he'd discovered the power of repetition and planned to use it for everything. Gwen watched from the doorway, her hand resting on the small swell of her stomach. Not obvious yet, not showing, but there, real, growing. She and Giorgio had found out 3 days ago, had stared at the pregnancy test together while Roland napped, both of them silent with wonder. "We're having another baby," Gwen had whispered. "We are," Giorgio had confirmed, then kissed her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever held. Now, watching him play with Roland, she tried to imagine 2 children, tried to picture their family growing, tried to reconcile this reality with the terrified single mother she'd been a year ago. "What are you smiling about?" Giorgio asked, noticing her in the doorway. "Everything," Gwen said honestly. "Absolutely everything." She crossed to them, kissing Roland's cheek, and then Giorgio's mouth. "I'm going to tell him soon," she said quietly. "About the baby." "He won't understand," Giorgio said, but he was smiling. "He will eventually," Gwen said. "And when he does, we'll tell him the whole story. About how we met, about the text message, about how families can be built in the strangest ways, and about how his mother saved me as much as I saved her," Giorgio added. "We saved each other," Gwen corrected. Roland, tired of being ignored, grabbed both their faces. "Mama, Papa." The name had come naturally, weeks ago. No one had taught him. He'd just started calling Giorgio Papa one day, and never stopped. Giorgio had cried privately, in their bathroom where he thought no one could see but Gwen had seen, had held him while he composed himself, had whispered that he'd earned that name through every single moment he'd shown up. "Yes, baby," Gwen said to Roland now. "Mama and Papa are right here." "Here," Roland agreed, satisfied, and rested his head on Giorgio's shoulder. They stood there, the 3 of them soon to be 4 in the home they'd built from accident and intention and love fierce enough to rewrite both their lives. And Gwen knew, with absolute certainty, that she'd send that text message again, would make that same mistake, would choose this man and this life and this family every single time, because some debts weren't owed in fear. They were repaid in love, and she was the richest woman in the world. The end.